Children around the world have stayed away from school to lead what could be the biggest day of protest yet against climate change. Thousands of separate demonstrations are taking place in 150 countries, including the UK. Well, the protesters are demanding more action from both governments and businesses, as our correspondent Duncan Kennedy now reports.
Home to 7.5 billion people. Beautiful but fragile, robust but warming. And today the stage for a global message. The Pacific island of Vanuatu helped send the first of those messages. And no wonder, their low-lying homes could be among the first to disappear if sea levels rise. In Sydney, children also put climate before classroom. Thousands marching with teachers and other workers to call for government action to cut greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, the younger a person is, the more that the changing climate will impact them as they grow and the less of a voice they're given today. Considering we have such a short amount of time to turn this issue around, it's vital that young people are at the forefront of this conversation because they will be impacted more than anyone else.
I think this is the most important issue of our time, and I'm here for my children's future. I think it's that important.
This isn't a fringe movement, this isn't a greenie issue, this isn't a lefty issue, this is a human issue.
They have to stop making political advantage of this issue and unite the country behind a crisis approach to dealing with modifying our economy to be carbon free. It's absolutely essential.
The Swedish environmental activist Greta Thunberg later tweeted her support. The new day in South Africa brought singers and dancers onto the streets. Here in Johannesburg, they also wanted to send a message to next week's UN conference on climate change that the speed of action must be increased. In India, the crowd seemed more modest, but in a country whose economy is expanding at around 7% a year, the government has argued growth can exist alongside climate controls.
Save our Earth! Save our Earth!
From Thailand, where this was still a day that found room for humour, to Berlin, where the crowds gathered to demand change. In Britain, around 300 protests are taking place across the country. This was Hove on the south coast, a place bathed in sunshine for campaigners basking in the solidarity of their joint action. At Harrogate in North Yorkshire, children again became the focus. The government said it couldn't endorse a school day being missed, but that message seemed lost here amid the enthusiasm of first-time protest. Bikes have been integral to Nottingham since the 19th century, and today campaigners used pedal power to push their climate message here.
Well, this is the most important, only important thing going on at the moment. There's no planet, there's no nothing.
I've never been a protester before, but we have to act now, otherwise it's just too late.
Oh no, they're in my way. Yeah, because I'm in a rush. I've got deliveries to make.
But the biggest presence has been in Westminster. Thousands have been on the march here, all part of a day of action involving 150 countries, and quite possibly the biggest global warming protest yet seen. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News.
Well, we have reports from our correspondents around the world who've been following the climate change protests, starting with Phil Mercer in Sydney.
There have been more than 100 events across Australia as this country helps to kickstart a global day of action. Thousands and thousands of people have gathered here in Sydney to campaign for what they're calling climate justice. I was talking to a high school student, a young teenager, and she said that she was too scared to think about ever having children because the future was far too bleak. They are angry, they are scared, and they're insisting that the world is on the edge of a climate catastrophe. What they want is for Australia to have no new coal, oil or gas projects, and also to shift to 100% renewable energy. All of this, of course, in a country, Australia, that relies on coal for the vast majority of its electricity. Will the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, be swayed by all of this? Probably not. In the past, he says that there has been too much activism in classrooms.
Here in Paris, it's hundreds, no, thousands of teenagers, schoolboys and schoolgirls who've decided to ditch classes this afternoon and join this demonstration from the Place de la Nation, one of many such demonstrations which are taking place across France and indeed across Europe as the youth movement seeks to weigh upon the consciences of decision makers around the world. The call, here as elsewhere, is on governments to get serious, to take not just what they would call half measures, but really important life-changing steps to bring the rise in global temperatures under control. Because, and it's the age-old, unanswerable charge of the young against the old, if nothing's done, it's not you who'll suffer, you'll be gone. It's us who'll pay the price. Here in Paris, it's hundreds, no, thousands of teenagers, schoolboys and schoolgirls.
Well, those were some of our correspondents around the world following the protests. Let's talk to our environment analyst, Roger Harrabin. Impressive protests in terms of the number of them, the scale of them, but will they make any difference, Roger?
Well, these strikes have been going on some time now, and they already have made a difference. You see politicians around the world, many of them actually want to act on climate change and cut emissions, but they need the political legitimacy. And these young people shouting that they want their rights, dragging their parents along with them, radicalising their parents, has given a lot of politicians much more confidence to go ahead and tackle climate change in various ways. And also, we didn't mention this, but industry is also involved in this upcoming UN summit. And today's protesters are going to be tomorrow's consumers, so they are really trying to do their bit too, at least many of them are.
And pressure on governments to act. The UK government has made an announcement today on wind power.
Yes, I mean, it's a very big announcement. A few years ago, offshore wind power looked prohibitively expensive. Over the less than 5 years, the prices dropped by around 2/3. So the new tranche of wind farms just being commissioned today will deliver power often without any subsidy at all. And that's something that really no one thought possible a few years ago. But I have to say, in the UK, although it's doing well in terms of its electricity, there is still major problems with the government in getting emissions from transport and housing down.
Good evening. Millions of people today joined protests across the world calling for urgent action to avert a global catastrophe. Pupils went on strike from school and workers left their offices to send a message about climate change to governments and world leaders. The demonstration started in Australia before spreading around the globe, including many UK cities. All of them called for a rapid reduction in emissions ahead of a UN summit on the issue. Dan Rivers now on the protests for the planet.
On a day when the world's children were called to act, in Britain they answered in astonishing numbers. This was the scene in the capital as thousands swapped school for the streets. And in Brighton too there was a massive turnout for a climate strike for young and old. In Bristol, GP Grace Thompson and her 5-year-old daughter Kitty started their preparations early. The enormity of the climate change crisis is almost overwhelming her.
I can't look my kids in the eye, really. As a mother of 3 children, 5, 2 and 7 months, if I didn't really realise the scale of the crisis, and since I've realised that, I'd do anything to save their lives, really.
This family, like so many others, deciding to cancel other plans and head into the city centre. And there they stood in protest at what's happening to the planet and demanded urgent action. Some teachers were here too, like Caris Greenwood with one of her pupils, Evie, both out of class for the day.
I would say this is education, and actually it's a really important thing that children know about this and what they can do about it.
We're here because we want to make the world better.
But by far the greatest demographic were teenagers, who will inherit the consequences of inaction.
We should be in school right now, but we're on the streets striking because we have no choice. If we don't strike, then the action's not going to happen fast enough.
This is one of more than 200 climate strikes around the country, uniting both young and old. And the central message at each and every one of them: the climate crisis demands action now.
Thank you, Birmingham. It's so good to see so many of you here today.
This was Birmingham's Victoria Square this afternoon, where the numbers were far greater than organisers expected. And this was Edinburgh, again packed streets with many children demanding change.
It makes me happy just to see how many people are doing this to save this planet.
The overwhelming mood across all the gatherings was peaceful but passionate. Tomorrow's voters signalling to today's politicians that they should be doing better. Dan Rivers, ITV News, Bristol.
Well, Britain was just one of 139 countries contributing to the largest climate protest in history. Organisers say at least 300,000 people took to the streets in more than 100 towns and cities across Australia. In India, while some children took to the streets, many more were being taught special lessons on climate change in school. The crowds were enormous in cities across Europe. 70,000 people turned out here in Hamburg and 270,000 in Berlin. And there are rallies across America still going on, including in New York, where the UN Climate Action Summit begins tomorrow, and where teenage activist Greta Thunberg has been leading the demonstrations.
This could only be a fantasy. I would never have predicted or believed that this was going to happen someday, and so fast in only a few months.